have a Bible, I'd love for you to go to the book of Psalms, chapter 33. And we're going to go to the bottom or to the end of the chapter today. I don't know if you ever heard the phrase that we parent through stages or phases. You know, Ariel and I, we've been married for 26 years. Privileged to have 3 children, and it's been an amazing journey. And we're in that time of the year, once again, in the month of August, which is extremely hot in Texas and probably around the United States for that matter. And when I think about August, I think about the going back to school. I'm thinking precisely of parenting. And again, we're at the place where we are empty nesters. We're at the place where our kids are now young adults and still connected somehow to schooling. And when I think about the month of August, unavoidably, I'm thinking of heat, which is what's taking place today. But also I'm thinking of football. I'm thinking of sports. I'm thinking of the newness of, again, school years, and Texas obviously is big on sports. For us, it became very personal once our kids got into middle school, because both of our girls, they jump into marching band. And there were long summers, long school years, a lot of competition. You know, both of our girls were very active, and we were in so many football games, you have no idea. Our youngest is a boy, and our son played basketball, so it was a little different. But regardless of the sport, whether it's a football or marching band for that matter, there's a lot of competition, or basketball. One of the uniqueness of competition is precisely the crowds that come alongside, from parents to family members, and ultimately it's just this support and celebration. For some reason, I'm getting the impression that Psalm 33, especially that ending of the chapter, precisely had that feeling, that sense of a crowd responding to liturgy and the response of worship, celebration. So again, in my mind, because of the trajectory with our kids, and by the way, I'm a big sports fan, so I love sports, and this is kind of the picture of this big crowd responding to the worship of the one true God. See, we have been reading this Psalm 33, and in my mind, I just cannot help myself but think about God's eternal redemptive plan. I'm thinking of the overarching purpose of God throughout history. And it is that uniqueness of that plan. It is the encounter with that plan, with God's eternal redemptive plan, that I'm more than convinced that the people, that the worship, that the response, we call this doxology, is typically what happens when you encounter the character of God. So as you read with me a couple of these verses at the end of chapter 33, I want you to think of the word doxology. I can give you many examples of doxologies, or worship unto the Lord. But one of my favorite ones, which I love to talk about, is precisely Paul, writing in the book of Romans. He's going to spend about 11 chapters describing, presenting, reintroducing, and in some cases introducing for the first times precisely the character of God. And within this entire description, this deep theology of God, suddenly, which this is typical of Paul, he breaks into doxology. So if you were to look at chapter 11 of the book of Romans, which, by the way, this is right between all this deep theology and then going into the practical section of Romans, which is from 12 forward, right in the middle, he breaks into doxology. He breaks into describing the unsearchable mind of God. So my point that I'm trying to make is that it's exactly what happens when you encounter the character of God, which in this case is going to be through his redemptive eternal plan, because God's eternal redemptive plan is based on who he is. Not just what he does, but who he is. Obviously, the people of God, which are the one responding, that's the big crowd, right? That's the worship celebration. We are the recipients of the benefit of that plan. So let me just take you briefly into verse 17. A horse is a false hope for victory, says the psalmist, nor does it rescue anyone by its great strength. You know, I don't know if you heard this before, but the good news of the gospel, or the good news of God's eternal redemptive plan, always begin with bad news. And the bad news of the gospel is precisely that what is it that man, who is it that we are in the context of our self-sufficiency, in the context of, again, our independence from God. And the psalmist, once again, in the context of worship, responded to the bigness of God and God's eternal redemptive plan describes the reality of precisely not just what we do, but who we are. I mean, I want you to listen just once again to the narrative on verse 17, how is describing, I guess I'm thinking of the word counterfeit, because that's exactly what happens. See, the presence of God, the fullness of God, the eternal redemptive plan of God, before it takes us into that plan, before it takes us into the purposes and the description and the character of God, it exposes our counterfeit experience. And the psalmist is reminding us and saying, see, that counterfeit is the false hope for victory when you place your trust in anyone or anything besides the character of God. You know, in the Old Testament, which is exactly where we are, in the Old Testament, we see many examples of the people of God deviating, negotiating, or adopting a counterfeit version of God's eternal redemptive plan. And I'm speaking from the purpose of election, you know, Abraham being elected or chosen by God, and then you see the lineage, the movement of God, and tragically that's going to get distorted, and Moses is going to warn the people of God as they possess the land, and obviously the previous generation fail to enter the promised land because of the falsification, the counterfeit. And in my mind, again, I'm just going through, I guess, the chronology of the Old Testament, and I'm thinking of the book of Amos, because Amos is one of the most difficult books to read, precisely because of them, the people, the generation of God, doing what verse 17 is describing. They're trusting in their horses, they're trusting in their false hope, and they're putting their dependence on the strength on things that are temporary and perishable. What are those? Well, here is, and by the way, I'm bringing the book of Amos, but Amos, as a prophet, he is preaching, prophesying, serving, ministering precisely to the northern kingdom. And this is called the nation of Israel. And in this context, the tragedy begins when these people took the goodness of God and started worshiping the gift at the expense of forsaking the giver. And look at the list. These are the things that they place their trust in their time, in their generation, this northern kingdom. And we can go from, once again, financial stability. That was a prosperous time in the nation of Israel. There was a time where they had what you might call church growth, but there was a lot of religious uproar. There was a lot of religious fervor, and tragically, the religious practices and their theology was not in sync with their lifestyle, and ultimately they were just very confident in their military power. And in that context, Amos again preaches and brings back the reintroduction of the centrality of God's eternal redemptive plan and the reason why they were chosen. And they will hear none of that. They want nothing to do with Amos or the message from God. The remaining of the story, many of you know what happens as the Assyrians are going to come down and do the unthinkable and take down the city of Samaria, the capital, and they go into exile. Well, here's what I want you to think with me for a second as we think of God's eternal redemptive plan. And even in the context of tragedy, in the context, because this is a very tragic time in human history and for the people of God, I want you to process what we're talking about between the rebellion of Israel in this case, or if you want to go into the book of Psalms and just think about, that this is not a warning. This is obviously something, I'm talking about verse 17, that is describing the reality of the people of God through seasons of life. So I don't know where you are in this scenario, but obviously the last thing that you want to do and that I want to do is to simply trust and think that it is my perseverance, my endurance, my commitment, my dedication. I will argue that the more that we understand and we embrace God's eternal purpose for humanity, for the church, for us, is the more that we are fully aware that this is who we are. In other words, what I'm trying to remind us is that God's eternal redemptive purpose literally moves against our personal agendas, which are always present. I'm always reminded that when you come to know Christ, that's exactly where the war begins. In other words, the flesh doesn't end at conversion. the war remains. We continue on the fight that we just like the people of God in the book of Amos, we continue to take the things that God has provided, such as a religious system, which it was important, financial stability, that was God's original heart. I mean, he wanted to prosper his people. And what about military? I mean, come on. These are things by default. They are what we may call neutral or amoral, amoral, and in this case, tragically, the people of God eventually will exalt them and idolize them, and I will even say that they will demonize them and took them away from the presence of God. Here's what I'd like for you to think with me for a second. Ultimately, this is about the sovereignty of God translated into the providence of God. So the sovereignty of God is going to utilize the brokenness of the people of God to accomplish his purposes. And the way that God accomplishes his purposes, which again is the redemptive plan, eternal redemptive plan of God, is precisely through his providence. Providence is simply the expression, the crystallization of the sovereignty of God, which is always in control. I mean, if God is not sovereign, then somebody else is, and obviously you and I wouldn't want anyone else except you or I. Especially us. We don't want to be the ones in control, because as just like the people of God in the book of Amos, we are number one enemy to our very own joy. And this is why this psalm is helping us to remind ourselves, how do we respond to this overarching purpose that God has established? Verse 18, look at the response of this beautiful understanding that we're not supposed to trust in our horses or put our dependence on the strength of anyone else. But the Bible says this on verse 18, this is Psalm 33, behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him. This is where, in my mind, it gets really overwhelming, because I can see how the book of Psalms is using human language to illustrate a non-human reverence. The concept of fearing God, the concept of actually speaking of the eye of the Lord, which we know that God doesn't have any eyes, he's a spirit, but using God in his missionary heart, this overarching purpose, this redemptive, eternal redemptive plan is coming. And this is what I mean by providence, is taking the beauty, the fullness, the majesty of God for our benefit. And the way that he benefits us is by utilizing human language, accommodating to our own understanding, that we are able to respond in a manner that we fear him. And the fear for the Lord, the fear that is coming before God, is the fear that is coming out of reverence. It's not the consuming, it's not the fear out of being afraid of him. You got to remember, and I'm gonna come back to this principle over and over again, because this is the gospel, is that the one who receive that detrimental fear, the one who received and became the object of the wrath and the vengeance of God, obviously was Jesus, not us. But in this case, I'm reminding all of us that this language that the psalmist is using is for us to, once again, to reply, to react, to respond in a position where we understand who he is, and that allows us to see who we are, and now we're able to know what to do. And this is why, when it comes to the fear of the Lord, I don't know if you agree with me on this, but I will argue that in today's generation, like never before, this is exactly one of the major problems. Since preaching has been negotiated and the exposition of the gospel has been compromised, the last thing that our generation has is fear for the Lord. As a nation, we fear a lot of things except God. So hopefully, as we respond in worship to this eternal redemptive plan of God, first and foremost, is not simply the improvement of our plans and hopefully the endorsement from God to what we want to do. This is about the character of God. This is about who he is, which describes who we are, and this is exactly how the psalmist is describing that. Look at the bottom of that, verse 18. Not only that we are supposed to respond in fear and reverence before God, but then he says, look, I guess you will call this kind of this is what happens. This is the end result of the presence of God, the eye of God over those who fear him. Now he says, and those who wait for his faithfulness. So here's the contrast. On verse 17 is speaking of those who did not wait in his faithfulness, and they're putting their trust in horses, they're putting their trust in military power. We just explained that in the book of Amos. If you go back again into the generation who left Egypt, they did not trust the Lord. They trusted the spies as they sent them to survey the land, and when they came back, they again, you know the story. So when we see the presence, the eye of the Lord over us, and in response, it's not necessarily the transformation of situations, so the improvement or the betterment of our condition, but it's that we are able to bring that reverence, the acknowledgement that he is God and we are not. Look at what happens. We're able to wait for his faithfulness. This concept of waiting in the Bible literally is the exercising of the mercy and the grace of God. Paul says in Ephesians that we are saved by grace through faith. The grace of God is the ability to trust, because once again, verse 17 is the perfect example. Without God, our trust still is exercised. It's just the issue is the object of the trust. So grace is the ability to trust. Grace is the ability to recognize that the only object that worthy of our trust is literally the presence of God, which in this case, I'm reminded in the book of James, and this is Jesus' little brother, half-brother, reminds us that faith goes hand in hand with works. So when it comes to the works, when it comes to the exercising of the faith, that's where the waiting comes into play. So the waiting in the faithfulness or the trustworthiness of God is nothing else but faith into action, which, by the way, faith and works or faith and obedience is simply the two sides of the same coin. And I'm saying this because James reminds us that, in my understanding of the Bible, is basically the book of James, with this as the main theme, is bringing or merging once again doctrine, and in this case, lifestyle. I've always believed that doctrine is relational. Doctrine, in other words, the deeper, the more that you know the character of God, the more that you think about others. The more that you understand the doctrines of the scriptures is so we can become channels for the purposes, for the overarching, for the redemptive eternal plan of God. This faithfulness of God, not of the people, right? Because again, verse 17, I'm going to say it again. I don't believe that verse 17 is a warning. I think 17 is simply the reminder of that's who we are. We love to trust, like the people of God in the book of Amos, and so many other examples. We love to put our trust in everything except God. Now, which, by the way, just a quick parenthesis. Obviously, I'm describing the people of God. If you are not a follower of Jesus, you got no choice. If you are not a follower of Jesus, you despise the Lord. You despise the Lord. You are walking in, and I know this is so offensive, but that's exactly who we are by default. This is something that we're born, and obviously something that we love to exercise, is our defiance before God. So in this case, speaking of God, the faithfulness of God is simply, this is what it described as the covenantal love of God. This is the love of God that has no strings attached. And the psalmist is saying that those who see the eye of the Lord over them, and they respond by recognizing the bigness of God, God's eternal redemptive plan, they're able to wait, to exercise their faith by being faithful to his faithfulness. And the faithfulness of God is based on his covenantal love of God. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. If I ever to have a favorite Bible verse, is Genesis 15, verse 17. Well, the entire chapter. But this is the actual experience of God's covenantal love, which is basically having that contractual relationship with Abraham, where he's taken into this vision, and through that vision or dream, Abraham is commanded to sacrifice, and they're gonna create that covenant. And the beauty of the covenant is that Abraham becomes an spectator, and it is God and God alone that, through what is believed the Shekinah glory, that fire, consuming fire, walks through the blood instead of the two of them, because typically it was done by both parties, by both covenantal members. But in this case, it's only God walking through the fire, reminding Abraham that the covenant, the promise that we're making, is exclusively based on it's on my faithfulness. It's not on your faithfulness. And by the way, Abraham, if you were to break this covenant that we're making, guess what? I will take the blame. I will limit myself, and I will be cursed because of your disobedience. So exactly what happened 2,000 years ago in the person and the character of Jesus Christ. To rescue, verse 19, to rescue their soul from death. I mean, this is a totally new understanding, worldview, just perception of life. Once we understand the overarching purpose, the eternal redemptive plan of God, we're able to process life differently. And I want you to listen to the language, because this is what happens as a result of waiting, of trusting in the trustworthiness of God. This is what happens when we place, again, our faith not in horses or anything else except in the character. If we can, again, the people of God, going back into that experience of Abraham, the Bible says this is what happens, is that God will rescue their soul from death. Now, if the psalmist, or God in this case, was some sort of a modern preacher today, they will be more of a changing of circumstances instead of a soul in death. In other words, in today's culture, tragically, what really works when it comes to preaching and the attractional mode of exposition of the word, which I don't think is a word, but it's more of a, people are not as concerned about whether this is true or false. They want a gospel that simply works, and it works now. Man, this is why we're placing our trust in horses, in their might. See, the Bible describes a brand new understanding, because now He's going to rescue your soul from death. Now, quickly, very, very quickly, what are we rescued from? See, salvation is primarily, this is the bottom line. We're saved from God. That's the one person to be feared. Again, going back into the reference before Him. And when we say that we're saved from God, we're saved from God and we're saved by God. He Himself saved us from Himself. Obviously, we're also saved from hell, and we're saved also from self. Now, again, because of the confusion in our communities, I am more than convinced that most preaching today does not include the God component, because most people are thinking either life after death, or simply, I just need a gospel that allows me to become the better person or the better version of myself. Now, here's the challenge, and this is how I typically process this in my mind. With this prosperity gospel, this moralistic therapeutic deism that is so prevalent in our culture, a lot of the preaching, a lot of the understanding, and just going through the book of Psalms right now, I'm thinking of this experience of a hand extending into a hand reaching and both encountering. I want you to hear me say this. If you're not saved, if the individual is not saved by the power of Jesus Christ, there is no way you can raise your hand and reach out to God, because deaf people don't have any movement. This is more of people that have been saved, the people of God, deviating and coming back to God. This is extremely important, because they're rescuing, which is from God, from hell, and from self, creates a transformation in the person's life. Look at this. And keep them alive in famine. So once again, because this is so prevalent and so distorted from the gospel, that a lot of people think that non-believers can actually reach out to God. You have to be regenerated to respond to the gospel. Now, this is, once again, important, because look at the bottom of verse 19. And to keep them alive in famine. Most people will come to God. A lot of people are willing to speak of the overarching, the eternal redemptive plan of God, only if I come to God to avoid the famine. Listen to the language. He's not implying that you will avoid the famine. I'm thinking of the Gospels narrative, where there is two men, a wise man and a foolish man. And one builds the house on the rock, and the other one builds the house sand. The important thing about this narrative given by Jesus is that both are going to get hit by the storm. A lot of people think that if you build it on the rock, you're going to avoid the storm. No, you're still going to get hit. In this case, the famine is still going to be present. One of the best ways for me to illustrate this is Philippians 4:13, a prison letter. Paul, writing from prison, describes and says, I can do all things through, here's the object. The object is Him, not me. It's Him. And what's the win if I were to put my trust in His trustworthiness? What's the win if I am to embrace His eternal redemptive plan? Well, once again, this guy who's writing, speaking to a church that is going through a lot, the end result is incarceration. So it doesn't look very attractive to put my trust in Him. And I'm saying this because of, once again, this word famine. Now, look at the focus and the emphasis on verse 13 of Philippians 4. The promise is that He will strengthen us. It's not that you're going to be able to do everything, but it's going to be strengthened in the context of opposition, in the context of famine, in the context of difficulty. See, the reality is that 2,000 years ago, there was one person that was not strengthened. There was one person that was left alone, denied, and that person was Jesus Christ. So today the invitation is very clear that if or since we all go through famines, if or since everyone faces the reality of difficulties, the promise today, if we were to embrace God's eternal redemptive plan, which once again brings doxology, brings worship, is that we will be strengthened. Verse 20, our soul waits for the Lord. The Bible does not condemn the surroundings, the physical matter. Obviously, God redeems everything for His sake and everything in His time. But once again, look at the perspective, the world view, the understanding how the paradigm shifts around. And now the psalmist is speaking of the soul who waits for the Lord. The understanding of waiting in the Lord, this concept of waiting, again, in my mind, I'm going to Paul, I'm going to Romans chapter 8, and specifically verses, 28, 29, which are extremely known. And maybe most of you have heard those verses where Paul reminds us that everything, we know that for those who love the Lord, everything works for the good of those who, and then he describes and he goes into the doctrine of election. Please hear me say this. The promise that He has given us when we are able to wait for the Lord instead of putting our trust in anything else is that we will be able. This is the strengthening of the Lord from Philippians 4:13. The strengthening is that we're going to be able to process the immediate through the ultimate. That we're going to have the ability in the context of loss, in the context of grief, in the context of success. Because I'm going through the book of Amos. In Amos, man, everything was moving upward, right? And in that context of idolatry and disobedience and separating doctrine from lifestyle, we know the remaining of the story. So in this case, regardless of where we are as a generation, I'm thinking again as a father of three, 25, 23, and 21, I'm thinking, I've lived long enough in this life that it's a matter of time. We all go through famines. We'll go through the experience and the crossroads. Either you're going to wait on the Lord or you're going to take matters on your own hand. And at the end of the day, the conversation is, can we develop the understanding? Can we ground our reaction to life through the concept and the worldview that we process the reality of the losses, the reality of the grief, the reality of whatever is happening or could happen, that reality we process through the ultimate. Waiting on the Lord is the ability to see God for who He is. Who is God? Oh my goodness. Beautiful language, beautiful poetry, poetic language. And He says He is our help. I love the communal concept of the our, right? It's not my help, but our help. And He says, and He is our shield. Once again, He is not the person who dissipates the conflict or the confrontation or the famine. He is simply the help that we need in times of trouble. He is simply the shield that we need in times of storms or conflict, of desolation, or whatever the case might be. Now, again, this is more of a tradition. And tradition will tell you that Moses is the one attributed to Psalm 90, which is one of my favorite Psalms to read, just because of the contrast of the eternality of God and the transitoriness of man. Man is a transient and we are eternal. Now, I love to think and to see this Psalm through the perspective of an old Moses, speaking to the younger generation, speaking in the book of, Deuteronomy to the ones who are going to possess the land. And I'm just thinking of this reflection. He's coming to the conclusion. He's coming to this kind of a ministry of succession, just conveying in a nutshell what this whole deal of life is all about. And he basically says, Lord, personal name of God, you have been our dwelling place. You have been our dwelling place in the context of nomadic life, in the context of lack of identity, so to speak, in the context of, oh my goodness, trying to get to that place of fulfillment and really the promises of God coming into reality. Moses is able to declare, you are the wind. In other words, the promised land, the nation of Israel, as important as they are, and they are important in God's eternal redemptive plan, what you get at the end, when you go through the famine, when you go through the valley of the shadow and death, what you get at the end is a person, is the person of God. And Moses says, you are our dwelling place in all generations. Once again, I'm picturing this dual experience of Moses looking through the windshield and helping this generation to move forward. But you got to remember where you come from. You got to remember who he is, so you will never get distracted of who you are and what you are called to do. We're at the beginning of a brand new school year, so this is a prayer that we can definitely pray for as school teachers. Safety over our academic world. Oh my God, we need professors. We're grateful for our professors, our administrators, our kids and grandkids going into school. Let's just pray for them and remind them that the response of this is, for our heart rejoices in him. The Bible has not implied that circumstances have changed. The Bible does not guarantee that circumstances are going to improve. What the Bible says is that we will be changed and we will be able to rejoice in him. The implication of this joy is simply that we're able to distinguish, once again, processing the immediate through the ultimate, that we're able to find joy, to rejoice in, but not for the circumstances. Once again, Paul, prison letter, Philippians chapter 1, verse 21. Many of you can recite that. For me to live is Christ. For me to live is not to be free from incarceration. Many of us can think that life is the absence of death. No. See, Paul is saying, for me, life is a person. And then death is simply that person to the fullest. It's gain. It's the access. It's the encounter. It's the inheritance. It's simply Jesus, Paul says. So again, we find our joy, our heart rejoices in him because, and this is why we rejoice, because our worldview has changed, because we're able to merge our doctrine with lifestyle, because we understand that faith is the gift given by God. Undeserving. This is mercy. This is grace. Which, by the way, this is something that he gives on a voluntary basis, right? We cannot demand it. We cannot expect it. This is simply God's sovereignty and providence given to us, so we trust in his holy name. I don't know if you find any rest in the words of the psalmist, because our tendency, your tendency and my tendency, is to trust in our ability, in horses, in so many other things. And I'm going to say this again. The beauty of faith is not that you're going to remain faithful. The beauty of the faith that comes from God is that he is going to remain faithful in spite of, regardless of what takes place. And when you see the brokenness of the world, when you see the challenges in your life and the demise of my health and whatever other challenges we may find, we rest upon the trustworthiness of God. And I'm here to tell you, he is trustworthy. trustworthy. How do I know this? Because look at how he closes. He simply closes by saying, let your trustworthiness, your covenantal, loyal, no strings attached favor, let it be upon us. In other words, I'm at the place, just like Paul, incarcerated. I just don't care what happens. It doesn't take my sleep. It doesn't take my worry anymore. Whether we succeed, whether we are in any scenario, we have learned that the win is the favor of the Lord. So I'm going to say that again. We are at the beginning of a brand new school year. Kids, grandkids, beautiful generation, moving forward the gospel. May the favor of the Lord be upon them. This is the favor of God that allows for the Church of Jesus to persevere, because he has chosen to preserve the people of God. See, the challenge for you and I on how he shows his favor. He shows the favor. Look at the bottom of that 22. Just as we have waited for you. So here is the unresolved tension of God's divine intervention, God's eternal redemptive plan exercised through broken vessels. I'm going to say it again. This is God's eternal, this is James at his best, right? This is doctrine married or remarried or merged with lifestyle. This is faith and works. This is the undeserving, again, covenantal, no strings attached, mercy of God shown, exercised through the faithfulness, through the commitment, through the life of men and women who have chosen to wait for the Lord. All that I'm trying to tell you today is that as we, again, burst into doxology and we recognize this beautiful, beautiful, eternal, redemptive plan of God that produces the joy and the ability to wait on the Lord, the reason why we need to do this is because apparently the way God preserves his people is precisely through the waiting, through the development of the character of Jesus that 2,000 years ago, this very same Jesus waited on the Lord and nobody responded to his call. He called upon the Father and the Father forsook the Son. The Father turned away from the Son, and he turned away from the Son because Paul says in Corinthians that the one who knew no sin for our sake. See, Jesus became on that Friday, the most grotesque and the most obscene expression and accumulation of rebellion, of obscenity before the presence of God. And God had no choice but to turn away from Jesus as he took our responsibility. He absorbed our penalty and our guilt. And eventually he's going to die. Eventually he's going to bring this entire covenantal relationship to a conclusion, that it was paid in full. So today, you and I can be empowered. Instead of trusting in anything else, be free, not from oppression, not from difficulties, but be free to really persevere to the end. Because the Son was able to persevere, and his perseverance, his faithfulness, reflected and rewarded through his resurrection, has been transferred, accredited, and imputed to us, that we today are able to see the holiness and the righteousness and the character of Jesus as the win. And this is what we call sanctification, reflected on the way that we worship God because of his redemptive, eternal redemptive plan. Have a wonderful day and God bless.